Okay guys, so now we would want to learn how the pieces move. Knowing how to move the pieces is fundamental to playing the game of chess. So we have 6 types of pieces, and we are going to go through them one by one in brief, just to learn how they move, their basic movements. So let's start with the pawn. Pawns are considered the foot soldiers. They are the infantry in your army, risking their lives on the front lines of your empire. Each pawn is 1 point in value, material value, and moves 1 square at a time in one direction, that is, forward. A pawn can also move 2 squares forward, but only when it has not moved yet, when it's on its starting position. This is optional. How does the pawn capture other pieces? Well, the pawn captures enemy units that are 1 square immediately to its diagonal, meaning that it is always a threat in those 2 squares. When the pawn reaches the last rank on the other end of the board, it can be promoted into a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. The pawn cannot move backwards, and the pawn cannot capture backwards. And since the pawn cannot capture forward, it means that it will be unable to move if either a piece on its side or an enemy piece is blocking it. Secondly, there is the knight. Now, the knight's movements are not so straightforward, and most beginners will tell you that this is the most difficult piece movement to learn. The knight must always move in a fashion that resembles an L shape, moving 2 squares in one direction and then 1 square in another direction. For example, the knight can move 2 squares down vertically and then 1 square to the right horizontally, which resembles a proper L shape standing upright. The knight can also form an upside down L, moving 2 squares upwards first and then 1 square to the left. Okay, here's another example. You can also move the knight to form an L shape that is lying sideways, such as moving 2 squares to the right and then 1 square down. As long as you form an L shape, you've got it. A feature that separates the knights from other pieces, besides the tricky movement, is the fact that it is the only piece that can jump over other pieces to get to where it needs to go. For instance, when you start as white, in order to use the other pieces, you have to first move the pawn out of the way. However, a knight can just jump even other pieces. It can just jump over other pieces and go where it needs to go, like so. Knights are fast, unpredictable, short-range fighters. Furthermore, let's talk about the bishop. So the bishop is easier to understand than the knight. The bishops move any number of squares in any diagonal direction. Zimbo beginners who are familiar with the local board game Draftotsoro, compare the movements of a bishop with a bobo. Okay, so if you look at the starting position of your pieces, you will notice that the 2 bishops are standing in differently colored squares. Since they both move diagonally, it stands to reason that the bishop in the dark square will never be able to move in the light square. That's why it's called the dark squared bishop, and the other one is called the light squared bishop. This will be very helpful to know as you continue learning about chess. Unlike the knight, the bishop cannot move over pieces in its path, and this represents the way in which its moves can be limited. Now let's talk about the fourth piece on our list. We have the castle or rook. The castle or rook moves in a straight line, whether vertically or horizontally, any number of squares. So we're saying that unlike the bishops, the rooks can link up, and this poses some tactical and strategic questions. We'll explore that in the future. For now, we just need to know that it can move any number of squares in a straight line. It is only limited by pieces in its path and the number of squares that are available on the board in the line of squares. The castle is often compared to the long-range siege weapons or tanks. Next, let's talk about the queen. Well, we already know that the queen is a powerful piece. A simple way to understand the queen's movement is by saying that it can move like a bishop or it can move like a rook. In other words, we're saying that the bishop can move diagonally like our sniper friend, but it can also move in a straight line vertically or horizontally like our powerful tank at the rook. And that's all you need to know about the queen. You cannot jump over squares just like the bishop and the rook. And yeah, that's our commander, our number one general. Okay, so now we'll talk about the king, the final piece, the sixth piece, and the final piece. We know that the king is the most important piece on the board. The king moves one square at a time, just like the pawn. But unlike the pawn, it moves one square at a time in any direction. One square diagonally, one square upwards or downwards, one square to the left or to the right, one square. The king cannot move on squares where it can be captured by the opponent. That means that if a diagonal path is occupied by a bishop, it cannot go into that diagonal path. It cannot go into a line of squares that are possible landing squares for the castle because it will be captured. Yes, so the whole point of the game is to trap the king. Therefore, it cannot be captured. When the opponent threatens to capture the king, they have to indicate that the king is in danger. They do this by saying check. When the king is trapped and is under threat and unable to get away, we say that this is checkmate and the game is over. So we're saying that when the king is trapped and it is in check, or it is being targeted by another piece, let's say a castle is targeting it, or a queen is targeting the piece, and the king cannot be defended or protected or cannot move out of the way, then we can say that the king is trapped.